everyone, I'm here to share our next read aloud with you, and it's one of my all-time favorite books, and I'm so excited to get to do this with you. This is called A Long Walk to Water, and it is by Linda Sue Park. All right, so chapter 11 starts with another really horrible event occurring on Salvas' journey to try to find his family. He's now lost the only family member he was able to find. And you know, the thing that I loved so much about this book when I read it the first time was the theme of the book, which is kind of like the underlying message in a book. There were two themes that, particular to me, are elements that I like in a story. And one of them is courage. When characters really are kind of faced with kind of insurmountable odds, where there are just events occurring that you just think, if it were happening to me, I'd probably just have to sit down and have a good cry. Because I don't know that I could really I don't know that I could do what he's had to do. And all of the characters in this book have really shown tremendous courage, and it's still gonna go on. I mean, we're just halfway through. The other theme that I like in this book is perseverance. And perseverance is when a person has the ability to just say, I'm just going to keep walking. I'm just going to keep going. Even though they're hungry, even though they are in pain, even though they're thirsty, they just keep going. So to persevere is to just continue on. So the characters in this book demonstrate both of those examples of theme for this book. So we're back now in chapter 11, and we're looking at Nyahs' story, and we're trying to figure out what these men are here talking about, water, right there in her village. And then we're going to see what's going to happen with Salva. I think he is ready to, I think they're at the Itang camp almost. So, all right, here we go. Chapter 11. After the men left the village, the task of clearing more of the land between the trees began. It was very hard work. The smaller trees and bushes had to be burned or uprooted. The long grass had to be scythed and hoed under. It was dangerous, too, as poisonous snakes and scorpions hid in the grass. Nyah was still making the 2 daily trips to the pond. Each time she returned, she could see that slowly but surely the patch of cleared earth was growing larger. The earth was dry and rock hard. Nyah felt puzzled and doubtful. How could there be water in such a place? And then she asked Depp that question. He shook his head. She could see the doubt in his eyes too. So again, I'd be curious as to whether any of you have an idea of what they think they're going to find, or how they believe there's going to be water there. All right, we're back to Salvas' story. They buried Uncle in a hole about 2 feet deep, a hole that had already been made by some kind of animal. Out of respect for him, the group walked no more that day, but took turns to mourn the man who had been their leader. Salva was too numb to think, and when thoughts did come to him, they seemed silly. He was annoyed that they would not be able to eat after all. While the men had been looting the group, more birds had arrived and pecked at the roasted stork until there was nothing but bones. The time for grief was short, and the walking began soon after dark. Despite the numbness in his heart, Salva was amazed to find himself walking faster and more boldly than he had before. Mario was gone, Uncle was gone too, murdered by those Noor men right before Salva's eyes. Mario and Uncle were no longer by his side, and they would never be again, but Salva knew that both of them would have wanted him to survive, to finish the trip, and to reach the Itang refugee camp safely. That's an example of perseverance. It was almost as if they had left their strength with him to help him on his journey. He could not think of another explanation for the way he felt, but there was no doubt, beneath this terrible sadness, he felt stronger. Now that Salva was without Uncle's care and protection, the group's attitude toward him changed. Once again, they grumbled that he was too young and small, that he might slow them down or start crying again as he had in the desert. No one shared anything with him, neither food nor company. Uncle had always shared the animals and birds he shot with everyone in the group, but it seemed they had all forgotten him. For Salva had now to beg for scraps that were given up grudgingly. The way they were treating him made Salva feel stronger still. There's no one left to help me. They think I'm weak and useless. Salva lifted his head proudly. They are wrong. I will prove it. Salva had never seen so many people in one place at the same time. How could there be this many people in the world? More than hundreds, more than thousands, thousands upon thousands. Okay, so we are now at the refugee camp, and this is an example of maybe what Salva might have seen as they were getting closer to the camp. And refugee camps are going to be areas set up where people can come from all over that have been displaced from their home. Different organizations, different aid organizations provide like plastic for people to kind of make tents. They're going to provide food and medicine. And so this is where Salva now is going to be approaching. So he now will have left Sudan, crossed the border, and be in the country of Ethiopia. So let's see here. People in lines and masses and clumps, people milling around, standing, sitting, or crouching on the ground, lying with their legs curled up because there was not enough room to stretch out. The refugee camp at Itang was filled with people of all ages, men, women, girls, small children, but most of the refugees were boys and young men who had run away from their villages when the war came. They had run because they were in a double danger, from the war itself and from the armies on both sides. Young men, and sometimes even boys, were often forced to join the fighting, which is why their families and communities, including Salva's schoolmaster, had sent the boys running into the bush at the first sign of fighting. Children who arrived at the refugee camp without their families were grouped together. So Salva was separated at once from the group he had traveled with. Even though they had not been kind to him, at least he had known them. Now among strangers, once again, he felt uncertain and maybe even afraid. As he walked through the camp with several other boys, Salva glanced at every face he passed. Uncle had said that no one knew where his family was for certain. So wasn't there at least a chance that they might be here in the camp? Salva looked around at the masses of people stretched out as far as he could see. He felt his heart sink a little, but he clenched his hands into fists and made himself a promise. If they are here, I will find them. After so many weeks of walking, Salva found it strange to be staying in one place. During that long, terrible trek, finding a safe place to stop and stay for a while had been desperately important. But now that he was at the camp, he felt restless, almost as if he should begin walking again. The camp was safe from the war. There were no men with guns or machetes, no planes with bombs overhead. On the evening of his very first day, Salva was given a bowl of boiled maize to eat, that would be corn, and another one at the next morning. Already things were better here than they had been during the journey. During the afternoon of the second day, Salva picked his way slowly through the crowds. Eventually, he found himself standing near the gate that was the main entrance at the camp. Watching the new arrivals enter, it did not seem as if the camp could possibly hold any more, but still they kept coming. Long lines of people, some emaciated, some hurt or sick, all exhausted. As Salva scanned the faces, a flash of orange caught his eye. Orange! An orange headscarf. Does anybody remember what happened earlier in the story? I think it was chapter 1, when Salva was sitting in school and he was looking out the window. It was almost time to go, and he was thinking about having some milk when he got home. He began pushing and stumbling past people. Someone spoke to him angrily, but he did not stop to excuse himself. He could still see the livid spot of orange. Yes, it was the headscarf. A woman's back was to him. But she was tall, like his mother. He had to catch up. There were too many people in the way. A half sob broke free from Salva's lips. He mustn't lose track of her. So Salva believes there's a possibility that amongst all these people, and these people coming in, that he spotted someone that could possibly be his mother. And you know, through the story, he's continued to hope that he's going to at least find brothers, sisters, mother, father, someone in his family. All right, so chapter 12. And I think you can switch to another slide. Yeah, and I'm kind of this one because I'm over kind of far. So here's another picture of what these camps look like. These were both actually photographs of the Itang camp in Ethiopia. And remember, Salva's story in this book is true. It is based, there is a real person, Salva Dut, and we'll meet him later. But these are actual photographs taken of the Itang camp in Ethiopia. So let's see what happens. Back to Nyahs story for a minute here about the men at her village. Oh, and in fact, Rachel, you can turn to one more slide. All right, so I'm going to scoot out of the way a little bit here for a moment, because it says an iron giraffe. And an iron giraffe is going to be this machine right here. And it comes on the back of this truck, and you can see the workmen, they've got like blue kind of jumpsuits on. And it looks kind of like a giraffe because it's got a small body. Here are the kind of legs holding this up, and it's got this long, tall part, and it looks like a little bit of a head up here. So this is called an iron giraffe, and you're going to see in a minute what this is used for, okay? But when you look at the next slide, I think you can kind of get an idea of what the iron giraffe might be used for. So, an iron giraffe, a red giraffe that made very loud noises. The giraffe was a tall drill that had been brought to the village by the 2 men who had visited earlier. They had returned with a crew of 10 more men and 2 trucks, one hauling the giraffe drill along with other mysterious equipment, and the other loaded with plastic pipe. Meanwhile, the land was still being cleared. Nyahs' mother tied the baby on her back and walked with several other women to a place between the village and the pond. They collected piles of rocks and stones and tied them into bundles using sturdy cloth. They balanced the bundles on their heads, walked back to the drilling site, emptied the rocks on the ground. Other villagers, using tools borrowed from the visitors, pounded the rocks to break them up into gravel. Many loads of gravel would be needed. Nyah didn't know why, but the piles of gravel grew larger each day. The clangor of machinery and hammer greeted Nyah each time she returned from the pond. Unfamiliar noises that mingled with the voices of men shouting and women singing. It was the sound of people working hard together, but it did not sound at all like water. All right, so Shannon, if you go back a slide then to, okay. Mother, mother, please! Salva opened his mouth to call out again, but the words did not come. Instead, he closed his mouth, lowered his head, and turned away. The woman in the orange headscarf was not his mother. He knew this for certain, even though she was still far away and he had not seen her face. Uncle's words came back to him. The village of Lauren was attacked, burned. Very few people survived. No one knows where they are now. In the moment before calling out to the woman a second time, Salva realized what Uncle had truly meant. Something Salva had known in his heart for a long time. His family was gone. They had been killed by bullets or bombs, starvation or sickness. It did not matter how. What mattered was that Salva was on his own. It felt as though he were standing on the edge of a giant hole, a hole filled with the black despair of nothingness. I'm alone now. I'm all that is left of my family. His father, who had sent Salva to school, brought him treats like mangoes, trusted him to take care of the herd. His mother, always ready with food and milk and a soft hand to stroke Salva's head. His brothers and sisters, whom he had laughed with and played with and looked after, he would never see them again. How can I go on without them? But how can I not go on? They would want me to survive, to grow up and make something of myself, of my life, to honor their memories. What was it Uncle had said during that first terrible day in the desert? Do you see that group of bushes? You need only to walk as far as those bushes. Uncle had helped him get through the desert that way, bit by bit, one step at a time. Perhaps Salva could get through life at the camp in the same way. I need only to get through the rest of this day, he told himself. This day and no other. If someone had told Salva that he would live in the camp for 6 years, he would have never believed it. No, we're still going to stay here. Shannon? Okay, thank you, though. All right, 6 years later, January 1991. They're going to close the camp. Everyone will have to leave. That's impossible. Where will we go? That's what they're saying. Not just this camp, all of them. The rumors skittered around the camp. Everyone was uneasy. As the days went by, the uneasiness grew into fear. Salva was almost 17 years old now, a young man. He tried to learn what he could about the rumors by talking to the aid workers in the camp. They told him that the Ethiopian government was near collapse. The refugee camps were run by foreign aid groups, but it was the government that permitted them to operate. If the government fell, what would the new rulers do about the camps? When the question was answered, no one was ready. One rainy morning, as Salva walked toward the school tent, long lines of trucks were arriving. Masses of armed soldiers poured out of the trucks and ordered everyone to leave. The orders were not just to leave the camp, but to leave Ethiopia. Immediately there was chaos. It was as if the people ceased to be people and instead became an enormous herd of panicked, stamping, two-legged creatures. Salva was caught up in the surge. His feet barely touched the ground as he was swept along by the crowd of thousands of people running and screaming. The rain, which was falling in torrents, added to the uproar. The soldiers fired their guns into the air and chased people away from the camp. But once they were beyond the area surrounding the camp, the soldiers continued to drive them onward, shouting and shooting. As he dashed ahead, Salva heard snatches of talk. The river! They're chasing us toward the river. Salva knew which river they meant, the Hilo River, which was along the border between Ethiopia and Sudan. They are driving us back into Sudan, Salva thought. They will force us to cross the river. It was the rainy season. Swollen by the rains, the Hilo's current would be merciless. The Hilo is well known for something else, too, crocodiles. Keep going. There we go. So this is a photo of the Hilo River, and so they would be on the eastern side, which would be Ethiopia over here, and here then would be Sudan. So the soldiers have come into their camp, they've chased them out, they're shooting guns, and the people now are running toward this water, okay? And so this water is going to be full of alligators. Okay, and it looks like our machine has once again cut off the best part of our picture, and I wish you could see the really giant long mouth and all the teeth of this crocodile, of this big alligator, I mean. So, all right, that is where we end on chapter 12. Okay, so I want us to take a look at the map before we start chapter 13. Remember, we started over here in South Sudan, right down here. And we've crossed this river, we've traveled all the way over to Ethiopia and stayed at a refugee camp there. And after 6 years of being in that refugee camp, what's going to happen, what started happening at the end of chapter 12, is the soldiers from Ethiopia said, we're closing these camps and you don't have time to like pack your stuff, you're leaving right now. And so what they're going to have to do is they're going to leave Ethiopia and they're going to have to try to find another refugee camp somewhere. They still can't return to Sudan. So this is the area that we're in right here. And I'll give you a little bit of a hint. We're going to be traveling south into the country of Kenya. So that's where we're going to be at in these next few chapters. Nyahs Story ended in chapter 12 with the iron giraffe arriving at their village and workers began to do some drilling for water. And you can see that things are starting to happen here. And this is her village. You can see people sitting around kind of watching. So let's see what happens. Nyah thought it was funny. You had to have water to find water. Water had to be flowing constantly into the borehole to keep the drill running smoothly. The crew drove to the pond and back several times a day. The pond water was piped into what looked like a gigantic plastic bag, a bag big enough to fill the entire bed of the truck. The bag sprang a leak. The leak had to be patched. The patch sprang a leak. The crew patched the patch. Then the bag sprang another leak. The drilling could not go on. The drilling crew was discouraged by the leaks. They wanted to stop working, but their boss kept them going. All the workers wore the same blue coveralls. Still, Nyah could tell who was the boss. He was one of the 2 men who had first come to the village. The other man seemed to be his main assistant. The boss would encourage the workers and laugh and joke with them. If that didn't work, he would talk to them earnestly and try to persuade them. And if that didn't work, he would get angry. He didn't get angry very often. He kept working and kept the others working too. They patched the bag again and the drilling went on. All right, so now I'm going to forward ahead here. And we are now at the Hilo River, okay? And so we've got Sudan on one side, we've got Ethiopia on the other side. And remember, the soldiers are forcing them out of Ethiopia and they're going to have to cross this river. It's fast moving, it's very, very dangerous, and it is full of giant alligators. So, here we go. Hundreds of people lined the riverbank. The soldiers were forcing them into the water, prodding them with their rifle butts, shooting into the air. Other people, afraid of the soldiers and their guns, were leaping into the water on their own. They were immediately swept downstream by the powerful current. As Salva crouched on the bank and watched, a young man near him plunged into the water. The current carried him swiftly downstream, but he was also making a little progress across the river. Then Salva saw the telltale flick of a crocodile's tail as it flopped into the water near the young man. Moments later, the man's head jerked oddly. Once, twice, his mouth was open. Perhaps he was screaming. but Salva could not hear him over the din of the crowd and the rain. A moment later, the man was pulled under. A cloud of red stained the water. The rain was still pouring down, and now bullets were pouring down as well. The soldiers started shooting into the river, aiming their guns at the people who were trying to get across. Why? Why are they shooting at us? Salva had no choice. He jumped into the water and began to swim. A boy next to him grabbed him around the neck and clung to him tightly. Salva was forced under the surface without time to take more than a quick, shallow breath. Salva struggled, kicking, clawing. He's holding on to me too hard. I can't. No air left. Suddenly the boy's grip loosened and Salva launched himself upward. He threw his head back and took a huge gulp of air. For a few moments he could do nothing but gasp and choke. When his vision cleared, he saw why the boy had let go. He was floating with his head down, blood streaming from a bullet hole in the back of his neck. Stunned, Salva realized that being forced under the water had probably saved his life. But there was no time to marvel over this. More crocodiles were launching themselves off the banks. The rain, the mad current, the bullets, the crocodiles, the welter of arms and legs, the screams, the blood, he had to get across somehow. Salva did not know how long he was in the water. It felt like hours, it felt like years. But at last, the tips of his toes touched mud. He forced his limbs to make swimming motions one last time. He crawled onto the riverbank and collapsed. Then he lay there in the mud, choking and sobbing for breath. Later he would learn that at least 1,000 people had died trying to cross the river that day, drowned or shot or attacked by crocodiles. How was it that he was not one of the 1,000? Why was he one of the lucky ones? The walking began again. Walking? But to where? No one knew for sure. Where was Salva supposed to go? Not home. There was still war everywhere in Sudan. Not back to Ethiopia. The soldiers would shoot us. Kenya. There was supposed to be a refugee camp in Kenya. Salva made up his mind. He would walk south to Kenya. He did not know what he would find once he got there, but it seemed to be his best choice. Crowds of other boys followed him. Nobody talked about it, but by the end of the first day, Salva had become the leader of a group of about 1,500 boys, some of them as young as 5 years old. The smallest boys reminded Salva of his brother, Kual, and then he had an astounding thought. Kual isn't that age anymore. He's a teenager now. Salva found that he could only think of his brothers and sisters as they were when he had last seen them, not as they would be now. They were traveling through a part of Sudan still plagued by war. The fighting and bombing were worse during the day, so Salva decided that the group should hide when the sun shone and do their walking at night. But in the darkness, it was hard to be sure that they were headed in the right direction. Sometimes the boys traveled for days, only to realize they had gone in a huge circle. This happened so many times that Salva lost count. They met with other groups of boys, all walking south. Every group had stories of terrible peril. Boys who had been hurt or killed by bullets or bombs, attacked by wild animals, or left behind because they were too weak or sick to keep up. When Salva heard the stories, he thought of Mariel. He felt his determination growing, as it had in the days after Uncle's death. I will get us safely to Kenya, he thought, no matter how hard it is. He organized the group, giving everyone a job: scavenge for food, collect firewood, stand guard while the group slept. Whatever food or water they found was shared equally among all of them. When the smaller boys grew too tired to walk, the older boys took turns carrying them on their backs. There were times when some of the boys did not want to do their share of the work. Salva would talk to them, encourage them, coax, and persuade. Once in a while he had to speak sternly or even shout, but he tried not to do this too often. It was as if Salva's family were helping him. Even though they were not there, he remembered how he had looked after his little brother Kual, but he also knew what it felt like to have to listen to the older ones, Arik and Ring. And he could recall the gentleness of his sisters, the strength of his father, and the care of his mother. Most of all, he remembered how Uncle had encouraged him in the desert. One step at a time, one day at a time, just today, just this day to get through. Salva told himself this every day. He told the boys in the group too, and one day at a time, the group made it to Kenya. More than 1,200 boys arrived safely. It took them a year and a half. Okay, let's look at what Kenya looks like. All right, so now, the first camp that we're going to go to is Kakuma, And remember, when Salva left at the beginning of our story, he was 11 years old. And remember that this is a true story, and these are photographs of the actual places where he stayed. Okay? So now that they're arriving in in Kenya, and they are going to stop at the Kakuma camp, he is now 22 years old. So 11 years have passed since our story started. And he's pretty much been walking at least half of those years because he was at the other camp for 6 years. There's going to be another camp in Kenya that they're going to go to, the Ifo camp, and this is where we're going to meet a new character. So, let's go ahead and start chapter 14. We will be going back for a moment to Nyahs Story. I'm going to back up for that because this picture is going to kind of help with that. For 3 days, the air around Nyah's home was filled with the sound of the drill. On the third afternoon, Nyah joined the other children gathered around the drill site. The grown-ups rose from their work, pounding rocks, and drifted over, too. The workers seemed excited. They were moving quickly as their leader called out orders. Then, whoosh, a spray of water shot up into the air. This wasn't the water that the workers had been piping into the borehole. This was new water, water that was coming out of the hole. Everyone cheered at the sight of the water. They all laughed at the sight of the 2 workers who had been operating the drill. They were drenched, and their clothes were completely soaked. A woman in the crowd began singing a song of celebration. Nyah clapped her hands along with all the other children. But as Nyah watched the water spraying out of the borehole, she frowned. The water wasn't clear. It was brown and heavy-looking and full of mud. All right, let's go back now to Kenya. Oopsie daisy, let me move it down here. Oopsie, don't want it to go too far ahead. All right. Okay. Salva was now 22 years old. For the past 5 years, he had been living in refugee camps in northern Kenya, first at the Kakuma camp, then at Ifo. Kakuma had been a dreadful place. Isolated in the middle of a dry, windy desert, tall fences of barbed wire enclosed the camp. You weren't allowed to leave unless you were leaving for good. It felt almost like a prison. 70,000 people lived at Kakuma. Some said it was more, 80 or 90,000. There were families who had managed to escape together, but again, as in Ethiopia, most of the refugees were orphaned boys and young men. The local people who lived in the area did not like having the refugee camp nearby. They would often sneak in and steal from the refugees. Sometimes fights broke out and people were hurt or killed. After 2 years of misery at Kakuma, Salva decided to leave the camp. He had heard of another refugee camp far to the south and west, where he hoped things would get better. Once again, Salva and a few other young men walked for months. But when they reached the camp at Ifo, they found that things were no different than at Kakuma. Everyone was always hungry. There was never enough food. Many people were sick or had gotten injured along their long, terrible journeys to reach the camp. The few medical volunteers could not care for everyone who needed help. Salva felt fortunate that at least he was in good health. He wanted desperately to work, to make a little money that he could use to buy extra food. He even dreamed of saving some money so that one day he could leave the camp and continue his education somewhere. But there was no work. There was nothing to do but wait. Wait for the next meal. Wait for news of the world outside the camp. The days were long and empty. They stretched into weeks, then months, then years. It was hard to keep hope alive when there was so little to feed it. Michael was an aid worker from a country called Ireland. Let's meet Michael. Here he is. All right, so here's Michael. Salva had met a lot of aid workers. They came and went, staying at the camp for several weeks or at most a few months. The aid workers came from many different countries, but they usually spoke English to each other. Few of the refugees spoke English, so communication with the aid workers was often difficult. But after many years at the camp, Salva could understand a little English. He even tried to speak it once in a while, and Michael almost always seemed to understand what Salva was trying to say. One day after the morning meal, Michael spoke to Salva. "You seem interested in learning English," he said. "How'd you like to learn to read?" The lessons began that very day. Michael wrote down 3 letters on a small scrap of paper. A-B-C, he said, handing the scrap to Salva. A-B-C, Salva repeated. The whole rest of the day, Salva went around saying, A-B-C. mostly to himself, but sometimes aloud, in a quiet voice. He looked at the paper 100 times and practiced drawing the letters in the dirt with a stick, over and over again. Salva remembered learning to read Arabic when he was young. The Arabic alphabet had 28 letters, the English only 26. In English, the letters stayed separate from each other, so it was easy to tell them apart. In Arabic words, the letters were always joined, and letters might look different depending upon what came before or after it. "Sure, you're doing lovely," Michael said the day Salva learned to write his own name. "You learn fast because you work so hard." Salva did not say that he was thinking that he was working hard because he wanted to learn to read English before Michael left the camp. Salva did not know if any of the other aid workers would take the time to teach him. But once in a while, it's good to take a break from work. Let's do something a wee bit different for a change. I'm thinking that you'll be good at this. You're a tall lad. So Salva learned 2 things from Michael: how to read and how to play volleyball. A rumor was spreading through the camp. It began as a whisper, but soon Salva felt as if it was a roar in his ears. He could think of nothing else. America, the United States. The rumor was that about 300 boys and young men from the refugee camp would be chosen to go to live in America. Salva could not believe it. How could it be true? How would they get there? Where would they live? Surely it was impossible. But as the days went by and the aid workers confirmed the news, it was all anyone could talk about. They only want healthy people. If you're sick, you won't be chosen. They won't take you if you have ever been a soldier with the rebels. Only orphans are being chosen. If you have any family left, you have to stay here. Weeks passed, then months. One day a notice was posted at the camp's administration tent. It was a list of names. If your name was on the list, it meant that you had made it to the next step, the interview. After the interview, you might go to America. Salva's name was not on the list, nor was it on the next list or on the one after that. Many of the boys being chosen were younger than Salva. Perhaps America doesn't want anyone too old, he thought. Each time the list was posted, Salva's heart would pound as he read the names. He tried not to lose hope. At the same time, he tried not to hope too much. Sometimes he felt as if he were being torn in two by the hoping and not hoping. One windy afternoon, Michael rushed over to Salva's tent. "Salva, come quickly, your name is on the list today." Salva leapt to his feet and was running even before his friend had finished speaking. When he drew near the administration tent, he slowed down and tried to catch his breath. He might be wrong. It might be another person named Salva. I won't look too soon. From far away, I might see a name that looks like mine. I need to be sure. Salva shouldered his way through the crowd until he was standing in front of the list. He raised his head slowly and then began reading through the names. There it was. Salva Duke, Rochester, New York. Salva was going to New York. He was going to America. All right, so here's a picture of the guys getting on an airplane that's going to take them eventually to the United States.